At the beginning of this week, leaders of the world's 7 richest nations met to discuss a host of global issues. But what remained in focus was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. G7 leaders have vowed to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. But will the West live up to its promise? So far, the West has displayed unprecedented unity in imposing sanctions on the Russian President, Putin, and his country. But for how long can the West continue to do so? The NATO says the war could go on for years. Experts suggest a long conflict could erode the West's resolve to help Ukraine in the battle against Russia. Ukraine also fears that war fatigue could bring down the West's determination to push back against Moscow's aggression. Let's now understand where the key global players stand in terms of this conflict. Beginning with Russia, for the last few weeks, Russian forces have been focusing on Ukraine's east. But as the G7 summit kicked off, Putin's army targeted major Ukrainian cities once again. The Kremlin says Russia would halt its offensive as soon as Ukraine surrenders. Analysts also say the Kremlin could exploit a dragged-out conflict and waning interest among the Western powers that might lead to pressurizing Ukraine into a settlement. But that is something that the Ukrainian president has ruled out time and again. He has rejected any kind of settlement or territorial concessions. Volodymyr Zelensky has been on a relentless campaign, fighting to keep the morale high among the troops. But anger and frustration among the citizens is now growing. The loss of life and property has been unprecedented. On Monday, Zelensky said he wanted the ongoing war to end before winter. Analysts say every month the war is costing Ukraine at least $5 billion, which makes it dependent on the consolidated position of the West. But for how long can the US and its allies stay united? At the G7, the US President Joe Biden stressed on the need for allies to remain firm, even as reverberations from the war take an economic toll. Which brings us to the European Union. Europe's domestic concerns are nudging their way into the discourse. A worsening energy crisis, inflation, soaring fuel costs, and raw materials shortages due to the war are all taking an economic toll. While the European Union leaders hailed the decision to block 90% of Russian oil exports by the end of the year as a major success, it took 4 weeks of negotiations and a concession for Hungary, widely seen as the Kremlin's closest European Union ally, to continue the imports. Further political fine-tuning is still required. Experts say the unity in the European Union is declining. They say a kind of fatigue is setting in among the member states on finding new ways to sanction Russia, wary of further economic repercussions. Some in the bloc are less willing to go on with further sanctions. The European Commission has also signaled it will not rush to propose new restrictive measures targeting Russian gas. On to India now. A special guest at the G7 summit in Germany, which has stood its ground, refused to buckle under the West's pressure. Since the beginning of the conflict, India has maintained its stance and has refused to budge. The government says dialogue and diplomacy are the only solutions to the conflict. Not violence, not sanctions, just discourse. And lastly, China. Beijing sees Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine through the lens of great power competition between itself and Washington. Beijing blames the US and its allies for being the ultimate reason why Russia launched an invasion. China appears to be calculating that by holding the US responsible for the war, it can drive a wedge through the transatlantic alliance and portray the European Union as puppets of the US hegemony. And this is in line with how Beijing views the multipolar global future, an empowered China in the Indo-Pacific, a stronger Belt and Road Initiative, stronger hold over supply chains, and yuan-based trade, all of which would make China less dependent on the West China's stand aims at decreasing America's global importance and making the European Union the third global pole. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.